co-chair Senator Hoffman, Senator Ellis, Senator Olson, Senator Thomas, Senator Egan. We have a joint meeting this morning. We've invited the Senate Resources Committee. We have the co-chairs here, Senator Paskman, Senator Wagner. We also have room for other members of the Resources Committee. Excuse me. Today we'll hear the first of four-part presentation by Pedro van Meurs. We will adjourn at 10:30 today because we have a conflicting meeting scheduled to get ready for the floor. We will reconvene at 1 o'clock this afternoon on the same subject matter, and then tomorrow we'll continue both morning and afternoon with the presentation, so we have it broken down into 4 segments. So with us today is Pedro van Meurs, and I'd like him to go ahead and introduce himself for the committee, give us a little bit of his background, working relations, not only professional background, but working relationship with the state over time. Even though a lot of us are familiar with him, there'll be folks at home that aren't, and then people that don't watch the oil and gas discussion as much as others may not be familiar with him and his past relationship. And we've been joined here with Senator French from the Resources Committee also, and Senator Stevens from the Resources Committee. Mr. van Meurs.
It is a very great pleasure to be again in Juneau, and it is kind of you to allow me to present myself. Of course, I graduated in the Netherlands in economic geology with a PhD. Then I immigrated to Canada and worked in the Canadian oil industry as a consultant for many years. I have been since 1974 my own consultant, and my main line of work is advising governments around the world about petroleum taxation and fiscal terms. I have done so. I have advised more than 80 governments around the world, worked in more than 80 countries in every continent doing this kind of work. In 1997, I had the honor to work with Governor Knowles at the time, because at that time there was the possibility for LNG exports to Asia, and we worked on the so-called Alaska Stranded Gas Act. Then from 2003 onwards, I had the honor to work with Governor Murkowski on 2 topics. One, the famous gas line, and 2, the PPT, as it was called at that time, the new tax that was introduced to assure better revenues for the state from the petroleum resources. I was very kindly invited by Representative Hawker in December to give a seminar for legislators with background on the current conditions in the oil industry. And so I have been in and out of Alaska many times. I think I have a good understanding of the issues in the state. And it is a great pleasure to give this presentation.
And if we could just, for the folks watching at home, Representative Hawker is the chairman of the Joint Committee, Legislative Budget and Audit, that handles our consultants as a joint working relationship with both bodies. And Mr. van Meurs did a 2-day seminar in Anchorage that the entire legislature was invited to, some of which will be repeated over the next 2 days here.
Then what I hope to do this morning is have the first session on a series of 4 that deals with policy options for Alaska oil and gas. The objective of Governor Purnell is to achieve a throughput of 1 million barrels per day through TAPS. I personally believe that goal is achievable entirely from the state of Alaska resources. And it is achievable, say, in the next 10 or 15 years or so. Of course, it is also my view that House Bill 110 does not even come close to taking a major step towards that goal. And consequently, I think a far more elaborate legislation would be required if Alaska indeed wants to see significant increases in production. What I hope to do in the 4 sessions is that it will be clear that major policy changes are required, as well as major fiscal changes that I hope to discuss during the seminar. If you want to reach 1 million barrels a day, you have to encourage very significant higher levels of investment. In order to reach that, in addition to whatever the companies are investing today, you would need to invest at least $7.5 billion a year to reach that goal. So that gives you an idea. Today, companies approximately reinvesting $10 to $15 a day per barrel. You would need to reinvest about $50 per barrel if you want to reach this goal. So a major shift would be required in investment patterns if you want to increase production in Alaska. Yes,
Senator Stevens?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't know if you're coming back to the million barrels. Will you be discussing that later, or is this the only moment you will be mentioning that goal of 1 million barrels a day?
No, Senator Stevens, what I hope to do through the entire seminar is illustrate step by step how you can reach that goal.
And Mr. Chairman, I guess my question of you is it your belief that this is a good goal to try to achieve? Is 1 million barrels a day a good thing for Alaska?
No, of course, what is good for Alaska is for Alaskans to decide. When I was, say, at the seminar and in other seminars in Alaska, it is my impression that young Alaskan entrepreneurs and young Alaskans look for the future in the state, look for new opportunities, look for new business opportunities, new employment, and obviously with a declining oil production as it is, that may not materialize unless you bring new resources on stream. So if you believe that it is good to create employment and new business opportunities for Alaskans, then I think it would be a good goal.
Thank you.
Senator Wagner?
Morning, Pedro. You said it takes $7.5 billion a year over the current levels to reach that goal. What would it take to reach the goal if we had, some of us had a goal of, say, 600,000 barrels constant in production?
Now, in order to produce heavy oil, say, and other resources that you need to produce, more expensive resources than today, you need about $30 a barrel investment. So consequently, if you want to achieve for every $100,000 per day that you want for one day, you need to invest $3 million. So it is an enormous amount of investment required to reach even an extra 100,000, because don't forget the ongoing production will still be declining. So if you want to stabilize at 600, say in 20 years or 15 years, you would have to produce an additional 200,000 barrels a day.
Okay, follow up again. Could you please, it's going to be kind of awkward with the way the recording system, but we need to speak into the microphones so the recorders pick them up.
Just to follow up, Pedro, we've been told by both major producers on the North Slope that are currently operating the fields that they're not demanding or even requesting anything to do with heavy oil or viscous oil until 8 to 10 years from now. They're not ready. Their fields, they feel, are much different than the fields that they're using in situ in Alberta, for instance, because of the permafrost and other things they're dealing with up there. So I don't see how we can figure into this anything doing with viscous and heavy oil right now.
No, I do not. Of course, they may not be ready because, I mean, for the current fiscal terms, indeed, I would not be ready either. But I don't see any special unsurmountable conditions in the heavy oil in the North Slope that, with the right fiscal package, would not be a reasonable encouragement to invest. Under the current conditions, yes, I agree, there is no incentive to invest in heavy oil. I don't think there is any logic to setting a timeline as when these heavy oil resources would be ready. I mean, it is ready when you have the technology. It is relatively simple heavy oil. It is not 10-degree API, it is 20-degree or 18-degree API. I don't see any obstacles why it couldn't be produced with the right fiscal terms. So I do believe that companies are, as I will explain later, are in the process of drawing cash out of Alaska. That is their goal. So I can understand that they may not be that interested right now in reinvesting in heavy oil.
Okay, go ahead and continue, Mr. Van Meer.
So, of course, if there are major policy changes, then we will also see significant possibilities for LNG exports. In the seminar, I'm suggesting to have 4 sessions. 1, the new policy framework required. 2, this afternoon I hope to address the international competitive environment. Tomorrow I hope to provide a detailed proposal as to how I believe fiscal terms can be structured to bring all resources on stream. And in the afternoon, I hope to extend that proposal to also include heavy oil, shale oil, and natural gas. So first, the new framework required. The new framework is based on a study that was also purchased by the legislature, and it is called World Rating of Oil and Gas Terms. So much of the material to be presented will be from that study. The study is available in the legislature if you want to do some further reading, and you can also find it on the website petrocash.com. Of the study, 4 volumes are ready. I'm about to put the shallow water study on the website, and then only 2 studies are left, which hopefully will come in the next few months. During the...
Hold it for a second. Can we back up a slide, please? Back up to 7. Could you give us a little more background on this world rating system? Because it's been in the press a lot around the state the last, for the last 9 months as the volumes became public, and I think there were some delays in publication, maybe some extra data requests or publication challenges. Could you give us a little bit more of a rundown on this, what this thing is and
yes,
why we should pay attention to it?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, what my firm occasionally does, the last time I did it was in 1997, is make a complete overview of the world, of all of the fiscal systems of the world, and see from an investor perspective how attractive they are, how they rate in attractiveness, so that governments as well as investors can see where the most attractive opportunities are from a fiscal point of view. It doesn't necessarily mean that it is attractive from a geological or other points of view, but this is a fiscal rating. In this study, I will be rating 140 countries in this world, so essentially all the countries that have fiscal systems or have oil and gas production or in which exploration is taking place. So it is a very elaborate study. I do the study per logistical environment, so to speak, so you cannot really compare the economics of, say, a well in Alberta to a deep water oil field in Angola. You have to compare apples with apples. So what I do is I have 1 study on North American wells, on the continental North American wells, 1 study on deep water, 1 study on Arctic conditions, and those 3 studies have been already released to the legislature. Shallow water is about to come, and then I will turn my attention to the onshore, and then I will make a final overview of that study. So the purpose of the study is to provide governments and investors with an idea as to how attractive the particular fiscal systems are to investors based on a whole series of profitability and risk criteria. That is basically the idea of the study.
Okay, thank you.
During the seminar, I will give some proposals on Alaska terms. These are not very detailed proposals. The proposals are made to just give the order of magnitude, to give the style of fiscal system that I think is necessary, and the order of magnitude of the amounts that need to be adopted. Of course, you can fine-tune these matters if the legislature or the Senate would be interested in a part of it or any of it. You would have to fine-tune it more to optimize the various numbers. But I think it is important to first give the order of magnitude and the style of the system before you go in further details. During the presentation, I will use quite extensively the concept of government take, and sometimes there is a little bit of a misunderstanding on that concept. So I have in the slide here a very simple calculation of how you determine the government take. For instance, if the gross revenues are $100 per barrel and the costs are $20 per barrel, then what you call the divisible income or the pre-tax profit would be $80 a barrel. Suppose you had a 10% royalty, 10% of the 100 that means $10 a barrel. What would be the government take? Now, the way you set the government take is you take the payments to government and divide it by the pre-tax profit. So that is how you determine it. So it is not a percentage of gross, it is a percentage of net. That is very important to realize. For the economist, I do this on an undiscounted real basis, and I'm using 2% inflation and escalation. So that is how the government take numbers are determined, say, that are presented in this presentation. As I mentioned, I do not believe that House Bill 110 would lead to increases in oil production. The light oil production is declining. If better terms would be offered for new petroleum, I think there would be some investment in new light oil. I cannot see that changing the major trend of declining oil production. If you want to start increasing oil production, then you have to start tapping the other resources in this state. The state has huge heavy oils, recoverable probably 5 billion barrels. So the heavy oils alone are sufficient to reach the 1 million barrel a day mark for at least 20 or 25 years. Potentially, that is not yet certain. I will discuss this in more detail. There might be shale oil. If there is shale oil, that could also be very large volumes. Who knows? You can even produce some liquids by converting gas into GTL. Now, all of this will not be produced unless the fiscal terms are different from what they are today, and unless you even define fiscal terms. Today, there are no fiscal terms. The policy change that is required, as I will explain later, as I mentioned, I did a large study in 1997. I'm doing another large study today of the competitive environment of the world. Probably the most important thing for Alaska is that the competitors of Alaska have changed dramatically. And I will explain that later. But because the competitors of Alaska have changed rather dramatically, the style of doing business has to change also in order to compete with these new competitors. And that means that Alaska has to do two things. One, they have to define what the fiscal terms are so investors know what the terms are. And two, for large projects, they have to offer fiscal stability on these terms. And this is, of course, a major departure of where the state is today. What is probably one of the most amazing things about Alaska, Alaska is the only jurisdiction in this world that doesn't have defined terms. As I just mentioned, I'm doing currently the shallow water study. The shallow water study will cover 125 countries. For all these countries, nations have defined what the fiscal system for gas is. Alaska is the only country or jurisdiction that has not defined at least viable terms for gas. And this is an interesting example. Also, of course, although there are terms for light oil, there are no terms for heavy oil, and there are no terms for shale oil. If you go to any of the competing jurisdictions of Alaska, there are terms today for these resources. So consequently, that is currently a major obstacle for investment. If you don't know what the terms are, how are you going to invest? And that is, I think, a major obstacle to attract new investment. So consequently, I do believe that if Alaska wants to achieve 1 million barrels a day, if Alaska wants to achieve a much higher level of investment, the first step is you have to say what the terms are. Otherwise, investors in Dubai, in Singapore, in London, anywhere in the world cannot judge whether it is interesting to come to Alaska or not. So this is a major deficiency of the current political structure in my mind. And consequently, this is,
Mr.
yes?
Meurs, if we can back up to that slide, what I'm going to do is just have you go through each individual slide, and then if questions come up from the senators,
Please, yes.
We'll have the questions on that slide. That way you can do your presentation, without interruption on that slide itself. Senator French.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This may just be a question of semantics, but when you say we don't have terms, I just wonder how that squares with the fact that we have a fairly comprehensive oil tax system on the books that will, take into account the different prices and the different expenses, for example, between producing light oil and producing heavy oil. I can understand what you're saying. I guess I understand what you mean when you say they're not designed for heavy oil, but we thought a lot about that when we passed ACES. We put into place a system that says, if you have high costs, you get to deduct them all. If you have low costs, you deduct them. And those high costs, of course, keep you from having to pay tax until you've produced a profit. So maybe we can do better for heavy oil and shale oil, and we're looking forward to your presentation. But I guess I bristle a little bit when you say we have no terms whatsoever. It seems like an overstatement to me.
Could you?
Yes, no, I think you have no viable terms for gas. I mean, the BOE concept really is not a viable concept. The terms of the current ACES terms are clearly oriented towards light oil. They are designed in the light oil environment, and they were not, in fact, we had very lengthy discussions about the heavy oil when the first PPT was designed. And we never designed special rates or special provisions for heavy oil. So I don't necessarily say that there are no terms for heavy oil. There are no terms that are specifically designed for heavy oil, like you would have in in Alberta, like you would have in North Dakota, like you would have, say, in Colombia or any other nation that has similar resources. So I don't want to sound extreme here. There are no terms that are actually designed for that logistical environment.
When we did PPT, the first go-around, as I recall, we had quite a bit of discussion on the 20% capital credit, targeting the heavy cost of heavy oil, because it's as Senator French had mentioned, it's a net system, and should be somewhat flexible when your costs increase.
Absolutely correct. The PTT, when it was designed at the time, there were considerable discussions on the possibility of stimulating heavy oil. At the time, the whole reason, as you say, for switching from the ELF system, which was based on the gross revenues, to a profit-based system, was to create a system that in principle could be easily adjusted to heavy oil, because since it is cost sensitive, it is easy to adjust it to higher cost. When actually the rates were set and reset, the rates were set and reset on the basis of light oil economics, not on the basis of heavy oil economics. And consequently, say the current ACEs, for sure, the rates are entirely based on the economics of, say, Prudhoe Bay and other large fields on the North Slope. They're not based on, say, Uknu or Polaris or other fields in that area.
Okay. We have any other questions on the slide? Okay, go ahead and continue, please.
It will be somewhat difficult to introduce those new terms, and I'd like to explain later why. Because, interestingly, Alaska has some structural kind of problems in how you develop policy. The first thing is, interestingly, if I work in what you call small jurisdictions around the world, like Alaska, not in size, but in population, that is, small jurisdictions around the world, like Alaska, like Trinidad and Tobago, like Bahrain, like countries of that nature, policy is developed kind of differently than in large nations. And so small, and I will explain that a little bit later. Also, there is a somewhat unfavorable dependency relationship in Alaska, where people feel they depend on big oil, so to speak, and that sometimes results in resentment. So there is a structural environment in Alaska that is not particularly favorable for the introduction of the policy measures that I'm proposing. As I mentioned, there is quite a significant different way of doing business in small communities, in small populations, say less than 2 million people per jurisdiction, and large populations. If you get to a small island like Trinidad and Tobago, investors can meet directly with the Prime Minister, in Alaska with the governor. There is a very desire on the community to be involved anytime there is a fiscal decision made. So many people in the communities are affected if a new project is designed. So there is a tendency in small communities to develop kind of project by project and kind of discuss each project in the community and then set terms for that particular project. And that is a process that over time leads to rather big complications, because the terms are going to be different for the different projects, and each term has so their own bells and whistles. And consequently, it also often involves lengthy negotiations to set the terms, and consequently that is the way kind of small communities like to work. Sometimes that can be a major advantage. Take Qatar, for instance. Qatar, population of only 1.7 million, has worked project by project and is now the largest gas exporter in the world and has the highest GDP per capita exporting gas. So you can see that small communities, because they sometimes can take decisions faster, sometimes have an advantage over the bigger communities. Of course, large populations, you can see it here yourself in the outer continental shelf. If you go to the outer continental shelf of the United States, in principle, terms are the same everywhere. And that is, there is one kind of broad system. Royalties may be somewhat different bidding round by bidding round, and that's it. And the same in Norway, the same in Alberta. If you want to build an oil sand plant, that's it. These are your terms. So large nations often, interestingly, have simpler terms, and consequently, they're often easier to understand. And large nations don't deal project by project. Like if Shell, for instance, wants to develop or explore the Burger, field. They don't walk to the White House and say, hey, what can you do for us on this field? That's not the way you can do business, say, with the federal government. So it is a different style of doing business. Now, unfortunately, the environment in Alaska has changed. The international competitive environment has changed very dramatically over the last 15 years. 15 years ago, what was the economic environment? 15 years ago, of course, oil prices were low. European and Asian gas prices were low. LNG trade was very limited. The focus was still entirely on conventional oil and gas. And in fact, the conventional oil and gas production of the United States was declining. That was the world of 1997. So where did oil companies go to find opportunities for other conventional oil resources? Now they went to Latin American countries, African countries, Asian countries. In these countries, you often have to negotiate your way through. You often have to sign production sharing contracts. It may take 2 or 3 years or a year or whatever to sign up a contract. So, negotiating deal by deal in 1997 was actually the way of doing business. So Alaska was not very different from the rest of the world at that time. There was only really one large competitor for LNG with Alaska for the Pacific market at the time, and that was Qatar. Now that world has changed dramatically.
If we could back up
Yes, please.
to 16, and could you elaborate a little bit more on your center slide where it says competitors of Alaska?
Sorry, the what?
The middle of your slide 16?
15?
16?
16?
The middle of your slide?
Oh, the competitors of Alaska. Sorry,
Yes.
the
If you
Senator
could,
Stepman, yes?
if you could elaborate on that list, why Latin America, Africa, and Asian developing countries are on there relative to Alaska?
The reason was that in those days, as you well know, oil production in the U.S. was declining. There was not really very large investment opportunities left in the United States in conventional oil under $20 or $15 a barrel. So there were not very much opportunities left even in Britain in the North Sea, in Norway, maybe still some. But investors, in order to find low-cost conventional oil, they had to go to new areas. They had to go to new countries, to new areas that were open for exploration to find that oil and gas. And consequently, the tendency was to go to Congo, Brazzaville, to go to Chad, to go to, say, Bolivia, new countries that opened up to see whether you could find this relatively low-cost oil and gas. And so Alaska was actually competing with other nations that had investment opportunities and that were typically relatively low-cost, had relatively low-cost oil resources. But in all of those nations, like India, like Indonesia, you had to negotiate your way through to get so-called production sharing contracts for the development of the oil. So that were, if I talk about competitors of Alaska, I mean alternative countries where investors would like to invest in. And consequently, that were at the time the competitors of Alaska. So consequently, the opportunities were in new countries in Latin America, Africa, and Asia. Russia was still largely closed at that time. It was officially open, but it didn't really have a viable legal system to work in. So that was the environment, say, in 1997. Is that?
Thank you.
Now, this world has changed dramatically. Of course, now we have high oil prices. Europe and Asia have largely linked their gas prices to oil, and consequently, gas prices in Japan are now the highest in the world. It is in the order of $14 per million BTU compared to the $2.50 in Henry Hub. Europe has very high gas prices now, around $11 per million BTU in Germany. So here you see there are now very high gas prices in Europe and Asia. As a result of those high gas prices, LNG trade is now booming. Anybody with anybody is trying to supply Asia with LNG, and consequently this has now become a booming market. However, what is probably also very important for Alaska is that we are actually no longer living in the age of conventional oil anymore. We are now living in the age of unconventional oil. Most of the investments in North America are going into unconventional resources, not in conventional resources any longer. So that is the new area of investment. And the most interesting thing today is actually oil production in the US and Canada is now increasing because of these circumstances. So we have an entirely new world. And the problem is Alaska has stayed a little bit behind in adjusting to this new world. It is fantastic that the three majors have now announced that they're going to look at LNG sales to the East Asian market, but the East Asian market has been at high prices for the last 5 years, so that is not what you call aggressive resource development. So consequently, here you see Alaska is kind of a little bit behind now in this overall new environment. The consequence of this new environment is that Alaska is now competing with other states in the United States for capital. Capital is going into North Dakota. Who would have said that who would have said 10 years ago that North Dakota would be the fourth largest oil producer in the United States? That's where the money is going. The money is going into new oil developments in Texas, in Arkansas, gas, of course, developments. Ohio is now coming on as a major target for new investment. That's where money is going. Money is going into oil sands in Canada on a colossal scale. Oil sands currently are 1.5 million barrels a day. They're projected to be 4.5 million barrels a day 15 years from now. So interestingly, Russia has now come on board with relatively attractive terms, and as you have heard, Exxon, BP, other major oil companies are now considering Russia a major target area. Brazil, with huge new discoveries in their deep water, is now a major target area. The main LNG competitor of Alaska is now Australia. Now, this is a massive change. All these nations have well-defined fiscal systems. If you go to Alberta and you ask what the terms for heavy oil are, they can tell you in 3 minutes. If you go to Australia and you ask what the terms for LNG gas are, they can tell you in 3 minutes. If you go to North Dakota, on state lands or federal lands, the terms are totally fixed. Anywhere in the US, the terms on federal and state lands are totally fixed. So investors now have massive, attractive opportunities in jurisdictions that have fixed fiscal terms. You don't need to negotiate anymore. You don't need to sit together with a government to come up with terms. The terms are decided, the terms are there. And all you have to do in Australia, if you want to launch an LNG project, now find a buyer and launch one. That's it. If you want to do a heavy oil project, oil sand project in Alberta, all you need is a small little document to be signed with the minister that approves the project, and you're on the way. So here you see it is an entirely new competitive environment, an environment you're now competing with OECD, largely OECD countries, which have defined and very attractive fiscal terms. That's the new world Alaska lives in. And consequently, yes, please.
Well, just before you go to the next slide, I'll let you finish up this slide, but then please stop for questions. Are you Are you done with this slide?
Yes?
Okay. I just got a couple, and then we'll go to Senator Egan. I'd like you to define, for those watching at home that aren't as familiar with this as we are, what conventional oil and unconventional oil is. A little more detail, please. And then I've got a quick follow-up on that.
Okay. Conventional oil and gas is oil and gas from the oil industry, from the oil business that we know it. That means if you want to do exploration, you drill exploration wells and you may find an oil field, or you may have a dry well, or find a gas field, and then you define the field, and if the field is low cost enough and attractive enough under the fiscal system, then you will start producing it. So conventional oil and gas is oil and gas in reservoirs, in accumulations, in fields that you have to find with exploration, and consequently, depending on the level of exploration and the risk of exploration, you may find them and then develop. Unconventional oil and gas is largely found already. We know where shale oil is. Even in Alaska, we know where the shale oil is because it has been drilled already. Heavy oil and oil sands, we know where it is. It doesn't need to be discovered. Shale gas doesn't need to be discovered. We know where it is. The problems with unconventional oil or the unconventional oil production does not relate to exploring for it, relates to developing new technologies to produce those resources from reservoirs that have already been discovered. Or not reservoirs, I should not have even used the word reservoirs. If you take, for instance, the shale oil that may be present in the North Slope of Alaska, it is not located even in any reservoir. It is located in the original source rock from which oil was derived and migrated to Prudhoe Bay. So consequently, conventional oil is oil that we know, unconventional oil rather, is oil that we know where it is, but it takes new technology to produce it. And with the high oil prices, technology is now very rapidly developing to produce all these new unconventional oil resources that have already been discovered but need to be produced now. So that is the biggest difference between the two resources.
And then on slide 17, one area that you haven't covered, and that's the national oil companies' impact around the world and how that may or may not affect corporate behavior. And if you could tie in that issue over the last decade and a half from 97 to 12, and why we should pay attention or why we shouldn't pay attention to the national oil companies' impacts.
Now, interestingly, the most amazing development over the last 15 years has not actually been with national oil companies. Interestingly, national oil companies used to exist, and with national oil companies, I mean 100% state-owned oil companies. And consequently, what we see is most of these 100% state-owned oil companies have particular roles in their home country, like Saudi Aramco, Pemex in Mexico. And those roles have not changed very much. What has changed, and that is an entirely new development that is also very important for Alaska, what has changed is that a new type of companies has emerged that I would call state-supported companies or state capital companies, like Petrobras, which officially is a private company, works like a private company, but works with massive support of its home government. The same as Gazprom, for instance, the Russian gas company. So new companies are emerging in the world that, and Statoil, for instance, that are national championship companies that work privately, but actually have a state role and a state function and are state not supported with subsidies, but are supported in many different ways by their own home countries. And that is an entirely new type of competitors that has emerged in the world. Now, that type of competitor may also be interested in developing Alaska resources because they go outside the borders of their national territory to explore and develop, including the unconventional resources around the world. So this is a very interesting new development that also didn't really exist 15 years ago.
Okay, we'll have questions from Senator Thomas, and then we'll go to Senator French.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You indicate on slide 17 that Australia is the main LNG competitor for Alaska, and we've concentrated on the southern states for quite some time now with even the AGEA concept. Will you cover later in your presentation how you think we stack up against Australia as far as competing with them with the close proximity to the Asia, anyhow, for the U.S.?
Yes, I will in great detail discuss that matter, say, in the afternoon.
Very good. Thank you.
Senator French.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Van Meurs, fiscal stability is a theme that runs through your presentation, and I'm just looking at this slide 17 and looking at some of the folks who you are sort of attributing fiscal stability to, and I see the lower 48, I see Russia, I see Canada, but my understanding is that fiscal terms can change in all of those locations. I don't, maybe you can tell me more about what sort of fiscal stability Texas and North Dakota offer. Maybe you can speak about Russia. I just read the newspaper, but it seems like about every 6 months you see a major blow-up in the terms of deals in Russia. I think of ConocoPhillips and the difficulty they had losing some of their assets to Russian nationalization. And furthermore, in Canada, it seems like in Alberta, they've changed the fiscal terms with some regularity. You may support the changes, and they may be good changes, but nevertheless, they do change. So can you just speak to the examples on this page and what sort of fiscal stability they offer?
Okay, that's a very important point. What I mention on this slide is that they have fixed and usually attractive terms, which means fixed means they tell what the terms are. You can go to the government, and if you ask what are your terms, you can get a nice little booklet, and that is what their terms are. You're absolutely correct in stating that in the new competitors of Alaska, actually none of the competitors offers fiscal stability at this point in time, which was actually quite different from the jurisdictions that I mentioned 15 years ago. So that is an interesting change. Now, in many of these jurisdictions, investors are willing to invest without fiscal stability because they believe the governments of these jurisdictions will act reasonably. Now, in the case of Russia, there is a question mark on that issue. And of course, companies that invest in Russia take great precaution in their deals to ensure that they are protected in case of significant fiscal change. Interestingly, though, if you look at Russia, the major changes in Russia has been lowering fiscal terms, not increasing fiscal terms.
Thank you.
Well, okay. Senator Paskvan, then Senator Wagner.
Thank you, Mr. Van Meurs. In the competitors of Alaska, you identify the lower 48, and I am assuming you're meaning jurisdictions such as North Dakota. And certainly in North Dakota, if you're a sophisticated owner with a high-class resource, your royalty will be approximately 25% of the gross, and then the tax is a little bit north of 10%. Is that within the definition of fixed fiscal terms, and is that within your definition of attractive fiscal terms?
For shale gas, generally speaking, in North Dakota, the terms are about 60% government take, which is quite attractive if you compare that, say, to even conventional oil terms in Alaska. As you well know, probably in North Dakota or in most states of the United States, you have three classes of land: federal lands, state lands, and private lands. On the state lands and the federal lands, the royalties are fixed, so you know exactly what your royalties are. On the private lands, of course, you have to negotiate with the landowner. Once you have concluded, though, your lease with the landowner, those terms are fixed.
I think that was shale oil.
Sorry?
Misspoke at shale oil.
Oh, shale oil, yeah.
Shale gas.
Sorry, I may have misspoken.
A follow-up?
In other words, those are fixed fiscal terms if you have a defined royalty, and then the defined production tax as based upon percentages of the gross?
In most states of the lower 48, you have typically 4 fiscal components. You have the royalty, of course you have the corporate and sometimes state income tax. Then you have the severance taxes or production taxes, as it is called, which are levied by the state. And then you have property taxes, as you well know in Alaska here, which are levied by the municipalities. So you have these 4 levels of fiscal design, which actually are common in most of the states of the United States. And for all of those components, the terms are known.
Senator Wagner.
Yeah, Pedro, I guess one of Alaska's problems is we can't stay with a tax plan long enough to do our tax book. But going past that, what other systems are out there, if any, that are similar to our net system versus how many systems out there are figured on a gross tax system?
No, of course, tomorrow I will go deeper in the design of the, the fiscal terms. But broadly speaking, interestingly, the huge difference between Canada and the royalties in Canada and the United States is that in Canada, the royalties are typically based on formulas and often based, and in some provinces of Canada, based on net profits, while in the US, like you have it here also in Alaska, the royalties are based on a fixed number. So if you go to Australia, some of the taxes are very similar to the PPT here in Alaska. So in the competing jurisdictions, also in Brazil, you have a profit share that is somewhat similar to Alaska. So you will find among your competitors, competitors that have terms that are fixed on gross, as well as competitors that have terms based on profits, as Alaska has.
Thank you.
Seeing no other questions, we'll go to the next slide, please.
Of course, the project-by-project approach in Alaska is a lengthy process, and that is very unfortunate because gas is a very, very aggressive market. And I have had the honor, as I mentioned, to work for Governor Knowles as well as Governor Murkowski trying to get a gas project going. But the interesting part is the process. Under Governor Knowles, I remember very well when I started out, everybody very enthusiastic. And then the lengthy process started of trying to introduce and pass the Stranded Gas Development Act, after which negotiations had to take place and say terms had to be approved in the legislature. Now, by the time the Stranded Gas Act was passed, Asian buyers had already found other clients, other suppliers. And consequently, the initiative, which looked very good to sell gas to Asia, kind of evaporated. The same thing happened with the big gas line. Governor Murkowski asked me to come in 2003, and I still remember very vividly that he said, Pedro, we have to present something to the legislature in 2004 because we have a very small window here. And it turned out that because of all kinds of internal opposition, it was dragged out, and after 4 years, this project did not go forward. So the process of doing things project by project in the new competitive world of Alaska just takes too long. And this is something that I think needs to be internalized because the market is changing fast. Gas markets are changing very rapidly. Buyers are very fickle. Asian buyers in particular are very practical. If you want to sell gas to them, if you have it today, fine. If you don't, they don't listen to you. Like, you really have to be in there aggressively if you want to get a gas project going. And I think the lengthy process that Alaska has experienced so far, irrespective of the merits of rejection or not, just the length of the process is too long to really be an aggressive player in the new environment that Alaska is in.
Okay, Senator French, you had a question?
Thank you. Just a brief point, Mr. Chairman. On your second bullet point, you have the date of 2003 there, but none of us, including the public, saw anything of that project until 2006. So that's really when it kind of came to light. That's point one. Point two is, I don't know if it was a missed opportunity. When you look at the gas market right now in the lower 48, had we built that pipeline and started sending gas there, we'd be experiencing little or no profit whatsoever, and maybe even worse.
No,
So I get your ultimate point, but folks watching shouldn't think, we missed the boat in 2003 because that would have been a disaster.
No, interestingly, you're absolutely correct. The process, the negotiating process was started in 2003. It lasted precisely until 2006 because before it could be brought to the legislature, as you say, absolutely correct. The negotiating process was simply too slow to proceed to a quick deal. If and this is, of course, an if is a mega capital. If the gas line had been approved in 2004, I mean, this line would have cost $14 billion. The tariff would have been, I still have my calculations, $1.25. You could even survive with a $2.50 market today. Very interesting. Now, you wouldn't have made much money on it, and who knows, it is maybe happy for Alaska that this line didn't come, because now you may have a better opportunity in the Pacific. But if the gas prices go back up, then it is a major lost opportunity. There is no question.
Okay, we have other questions on this slide? Okay, next slide, please.
So what I believe Alaska needs to do, and I know how difficult it is and what a big policy change that is, but what I believe Alaska needs to do is you need to start competing with your competitors. And this means you have to start defining terms. Ideally, Alaska should produce is a "We are open for business" brochure, a nice 20-pager or a nice 30-pager, as so many other nations offer, and say to investors, these are our terms for existing light oil, these are our terms for new oil, these are our terms for heavy oil, these are our terms for ultra-heavy oil, this is for gas, this is for shale oil. And if you can distribute, and if you can put that on websites these days, investors from all over the world will look at that. And somebody in Dubai will say, hey, these terms for gas don't look bad, maybe I should come up and look at this. And so consequently, but if you don't have any terms, if people cannot find out what your terms are, or if you have to come in and negotiate terms, then very little interest will exist in the current world, because there is more than enough opportunities today to invest in places where the terms are known, and you don't have to figure it out. So I think Alaska should move really from a process where you negotiate deal by deal, and then probably be too slow to actually be in the right time window, to a far more aggressive approach to present the state to the world and say, here it is, these are our terms. Now, what happened if nobody comes on those terms, and you publish the book and no results? Is that waste of time? No, because now you have very valuable information about the market out there of investors. Now you know, and you have hard proof of what investors are looking at. If you are successful, it is wonderful for Alaska. So I think this policy change is required.
If we could, before we jump to the next slide, Senator Hoffman, you have a question?
No.
Okay, just reading your body language. Next slide, I guess.
Okay, so now I think with the implementation of light oil terms and for existing and new production, it seems to me that no particular other implementation measures have to be taken if you want to attract investors than simply publishing your terms. Most of the investment in existing and particular new oil is incremental, and consequently companies probably, if you have attractive terms for new, companies will probably respond positively to your terms. If you want to attract investment to major new light oil, or in this case condensate investments like Point Thompson. I think, and if you want to attract major billion-dollar investments to heavy oil, shale oil, natural gas, or let alone GTL, I think you are back to fiscal stability. Now, you would ask me, why do you need fiscal stability in Alaska if you don't need it in Australia and in Alberta? The reason is the history of Alaska. Terms have changed here rather significantly over the last 15 years, and I think investors would be more concerned about changing terms than they would be in Alberta, Australia, or the lower 48s. So in order to overcome that concern, I think offering fiscal stability would be a good thing to do. The nice part of offering fiscal stability for Alaska is that fiscal stability in the North American legal concept would be very worthwhile. And actually, it will allow you to get better terms, I think, because fiscal stability would be very worthwhile. That means that you would have to have contractual relationships with respect to the big projects. Fiscal stability periods may be 10 to 25 years, depending on the nature of the contract and depending on the type of investment. And in exchange for offering fiscal stability, of course, what you would want to do is request significant investment, because that should be the goal for Alaska, to attract significant investment. And if with the lever of fiscal stability you can attract significant new projects, I think that will be very worthwhile for the state. I remember very well, of course, that fiscal stability, offering fiscal stability, is not necessarily a matter that is crystal clear legally. When the Alaska pipeline was discussed at the time, there was a lot of discussion about the legality of fiscal stability, and it is well known that the ultimate decision on this matter would have to be taken by the Alaska Supreme Court, whether it is even possible, of course, to offer that fiscal stability. But if it is possible, then it is a very valuable tool to attract enhanced investment under actually favorable terms. For Alaska, that is.
Senator French, you have a question?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Maybe more of a comment. Dr. Van Meurs and I have been having this discussion about fiscal stability for, I think, 6 years now. And I guess it's worth it just to take a minute to remind him and the public about why we've been having this conversation. And it's because our Constitution is black and white clear about this. We can't do it absent a constitutional amendment. Here's what the Constitution says. In Article 9, Section 1, it says, the taxing power, the power of taxation, shall never be surrendered. This power shall not be suspended or contracted away, except as provided in this article. I've looked into this a lot. I know other people have as well. No one has yet to show me a path to even allowing the Supreme Court to grant fiscal stability of the type you're speaking about, absent a constitutional amendment. So it's less about the Alaska Supreme Court deciding to offer fiscal stability and more a question of whether this body would pass a resolution to change the Constitution and the people of the state approving it. And I think that's just vanishingly small. I know you're a big proponent of this idea, but I just think it's politically unrealistic to expect it to ever happen. Thank you.
Yes, I'm not an expert on political realism, of course, and I was well informed. Now, you probably also have listened to the various presentations about fiscal stability. It was my impression that there were well-informed lawyers on the government side which felt that it was possible. So this is a legal question. This is outside the scope of my expertise, of course. All I can say as an economist, that if you can offer it, it is a valuable tool to attract investment. That is all I can say. How
That's fine.
political realistic
Do you have any other questions on this slide? Well, next slide, please.
Okay. Another great difficulty in changing, say, the policies in Alaska is that the major producers are what you call in a harvesting mode. I mean, their goal today is to use the cash in Alaska to invest in more attractive opportunities abroad. Their goal, as you can easily see from the statistics, of the $100 per barrel they may reinvest $10 or $15 in Alaska, and that's about it, which is a very typical pattern if you are what is called a harvesting mode, which means the major oil companies at this point in time clearly don't see major large projects left in Alaska that they would be interested in investing in. They see very attractive projects abroad, and consequently, they are in a process of drawing cash out of Alaska to invest abroad. If they would have sustained interest in Alaska, they would not be reinvesting $10 or $15 per barrel, they would be investing $50 per barrel. So you're talking an order of magnitude 3 difference here. So the fact that they are in a harvesting mode is normal. That is what oil companies are at the end of the life when everything feels mature. But because they're all in a pattern of essentially using the income from Alaska in other countries in the world, it will be difficult, as also Senator Wagner already indicated, it will be difficult to kind of get a new environment in which the 3 major oil companies, which can make such a large contribution to the state, will reassess the state and say, no, maybe we should start spending again significant new cash in Alaska. So I see a major obstacle in trying to reverse that overall trend.
Before you go to the next slide, Dr. Van Meurs, the harvest mode discussion, how long in your opinion or estimation has the 3 majors been in, collectively have been in this harvest mode? Is this just a recent thing that started last month, or has it been going on for a while?
This is now harvesting mode, you know, essentially in terms of investor behavior, you always have kind of 3 phases in a new petroleum basin. First, you have the investment mode period, where companies bring in capital, and if they are already producing, they reinvest all their savings in the same jurisdiction and bring in new capital in the new jurisdiction. That is kind of investment mode. Then you can be in a sustained presence mode, whereby you reinvest most of your cash into the same jurisdiction, in the case of Alaska, for instance, $50 per barrel, and only take modest share of the profits out. And then you have the harvesting mode, where you only reinvest a small amount of your income in the case of, because now the developments in the jurisdiction are so mature and the opportunities are so little that far more attractive opportunities exist abroad. Now, the oil industry has been a long time in a harvesting mode in Alaska. This is not the last months. This has been going on for a long time. In fact, the whole reason that originally the PPT was introduced by Governor Murkowski at the time in 2006 was indeed to try to make Alaska more attractive and try to reverse some of that harvesting mode. So I think these companies have been in that mode for a long time already.
Okay. Senator Wagner, did you have a question? No. Okay. Senator Pascal.
Is the corporate philosophy as far as harvesting mode influenced in any way in the likelihood or probability of not finding billion-barrel or greater reservoirs?
Of course, actually, I should maybe move to the next slide, because I answered that very question in the next slide. I do believe that certainly there is still possibilities in Alaska for investment, even for new light oil. I mean, let's not talk about heavy oil. There definitely are still possibilities for new light oil. My own estimate, but that's a back-on-the-envelope estimate, is that there could still be about 1 billion barrels, to be produced of new light oil. And what does that consist of? Now, the USGS estimates that there could be maybe 3 billion barrels of undiscovered oil. Usually a percentage of that is discovered in the next decade, so maybe 100, 200, 300 million barrels of light oil could still be discovered. There are a number of discovered fields actually laying around that have not been connected to the network, and with better terms, they may be connected. And also the companies are doing the so-called infill drilling. Now the infill drilling, of course, the main objective of infill drilling is to extract the oil faster, but typically with infill drilling, you would also increase the recovery factor in the reservoir, and that may also yield a few 100 million barrels. So I do believe that as a minimum there is still another billion barrels of new oil left. However, and companies are already infill drilling because that is a profitable activity under current situation, although it could be made more profitable with new terms. The major oil companies are probably not interested in exploring for the last remaining small fields, and probably not interested in connecting very small fields that are left unless there are better terms. So I cannot see much to invest in Alaska for the major oil companies if the terms remain the way they are.
Follow-up?
Is Alaska in a transition from where it was an only the three majors universe to where the three majors will remain, but we will have more and more independence and other world majors coming to Alaska? Are we in a transition time?
Yes, it is very normal for, if you mature your petroleum production, to gradually attract a new group of companies, typically smaller companies that are looking at the smaller objectives. For instance, Norway has a specific policy today to attract smaller companies because they feel in the British North Sea, in the Norwegian North Sea, they're now at the smaller fields. Britain has attractive terms for smaller companies, special allowances for the smaller fields to attract the smaller companies. They have special uplifts for newcomers. So if you get towards the end of the life of your oil history, like Norway, like Britain, like Alaska, at least conventional light oil history, then it is very normal to start to attract a whole new style of oil companies, smaller companies interested in smaller fields, smaller targets, and that is entirely normal, and I think that's what Alaska should do. That doesn't mean that large investment by the major oil companies will continue to be very valuable if you can stimulate them to do so, but it is at the same time very logical to start looking at a new group of investors.
I think this is the last slide this morning. I think the next slide, we go up to International Competitive Framework. We have a little bit of time left if we have any other questions for Dr. Van Meurs concerning this morning's presentation. If not, we're going to fire up a one. Senator Hoffman.
Yes, can we revert to slide number 20? Regarding Point Thompson, you know, the industry says that they're not ready for heavy oil, and how can Alaska be more aggressive with the company in the area of changing the terms so that we are more proactive in trying to get those 5 billion barrels of oil produced?
No, that is a very important question, and what I'd like to do tomorrow morning is give you detailed strategy, tomorrow afternoon, a detailed strategy of the exact terms that I think will do that precisely, so that you have an idea of what you could do in Alaska. This is my recommendation, of course, what you could do in Alaska to achieve the goal of the governor and to achieve the development of these resources.
We have another question over here.
Just briefly, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Will you also then be discussing, as you mentioned on slide 21, commitments to substantive work programs as well as maybe lease terms and things like that within your presentation over the next couple of days?
Yeah, sorry, you refer to other lease terms than fiscal terms?
Lease terms as well as what you consider substantive work programs for specifically to the state of Alaska.
I will not address the issue of substantive work programs because this is a broad policy change. It is not a targeted change. But the broad concept is to say if we offer fiscal stability, subject to the comments of Senator French was made as far as the uncertainty surrounding fiscal stability at this point in time. If you could offer fiscal stability, then that would be a very attractive way to attract work commitments. In most nations, work commitments would be commitments. This is not small commitments. You're not talking about a few million here, a few million there. These are billion-dollar commitments. Typically, the commitments are structured in phases, say a first, second, third phase, where you have to commit to. Typically, the second and third phases are conditional on certain results being obtained in the first phase. So for a heavy oil project and for a shale oil project and for a natural gas project, how you would structure those work commitments and how you would phase those work commitments would be quite different. But the broad concept would be the same. Tomorrow, I will mainly concentrate on the fiscal terms that would have to be offered.
Thank you.
Okay. Senator Pascal.
Just to follow up on slide 21 that you're at right now, when it comes to fiscal stability in their terms, you focus here on the substantive work program. Is there a reason why there wouldn't be an inherent focus on the production as compared to the amount of the investment? In other words, it seems like, for example, under either PPT or ACES, we've had over $4 billion worth of investment that the state of Alaska has made in its central North Slope region, and that $4+ billion, we're still seeing the declining throughput. So when it comes to fiscal stability, should the focus be on production as compared to just amount of investment?
Oh, the work program in a number of nations is being defined in different ways. In some contracts around the world, that literally says you shall achieve so many barrels, per day, or it is not defined how much you have to invest. The goal is a particular level of production, and if you don't reach that level, then there are penalties and other things in the contract. So you can, the work program can be defined in the production level to be achieved, or in the amount of capital to be invested, or both. So there are different styles of work program in the world, and for different style projects, it would be logical to use different style of work programs.
And we'd like the record to reflect that Senator Walikowski joined us a few minutes ago. Do we have any final comments for Dr. Van Meurs this morning? Okay, we're going to go ahead and adjourn. We'll reconvene at 1 o'clock for the second part of the four-part series. We are. Is that? No, I think we're adjourned. Adjourned. Correct? Yep, we're adjourned. Yeah, because we have it.
I have been since 1974 my own consultant, and my main line of work is advising governments around the world about petroleum taxation and fiscal terms. I have done so. I have advised more than 80 governments around the world, worked in more than 80 countries, in every continent doing this kind of work. In 1997, I had the honor to work with Governor Knowles at the time, because at that time there was the possibility for LNG exports to Asia, and we worked on the so-called Alaska Stranded Gas Act. Then from 2003 onwards, I had the honor to work with Governor Murkowski on two topics. One, the famous gas line, and two, the PPT, as it was called at that time, the new tax that was introduced to assure better revenues for the state from the petroleum resources. I was very kindly invited by Representative Hawker in December to give a seminar for legislators with background on the current conditions in the oil industry. And so I have been in and out of Alaska many times. I think I have a good understanding of the issues in the state. And it is a great pleasure to give this presentation.
And if we could just, for the folks watching at home, Representative Hawker is the chairman of the Joint Committee, Legislative Budget and Audit, that handles our consultants as a joint working relationship with both bodies. And Mr. Van Meurs did a two-day seminar in Anchorage that the entire legislature was invited to, some of which will be repeated over the next 2 days here.
Even an extra 100,000, because don't forget the ongoing production will still be declining. So if you want to stabilize at 600, say in 20 years or 15 years, you would have to produce an additional 200,000 barrels a day.
Follow up again, could you please, it's going to be kind of awkward with the way we're recording system, but we need to speak into the microphones so the recorders pick them up.
Just to follow up, Pedro, we've been told by both major producers on the North Slope that are currently operating the fields that they're not demanding or even requesting anything to do with heavy oil or viscous oil until 8 to 10 years from now. They're not ready. Their fields, they feel, are much different than the fields that they're using in situ in Alberta, for instance, because of the permafrost and other things they're dealing with up there. So I don't see how we can figure into this anything doing with viscous and heavy oil right now.
No, I do not. Of course, they may not be ready because, I mean, for the current fiscal terms, indeed, I would not be ready either. But I don't see any special unsurmountable conditions in the heavy oil in the North Slope that with the right fiscal package would not be reasonable encouragement to invest. Under the current conditions, yes, I agree, there is no incentive to invest in heavy oil. I don't think there is any logic to setting a timeline as when these heavy oil resources would be ready. I mean, it is ready when you have the technology. It is relatively simple heavy oil. It is not 10-degree API, it is 20-degree or 18-degree API. I don't see any obstacles why it couldn't be produced with the right fiscal terms. So I do believe that companies are, as I will explain later, are in the process.
Co-Chair Senator Hoffman, Senator Ellis, Senator Olson, Senator Thomas, Senator Egan. We have a joint meeting this morning. We've invited the Senate Resources Committee. We have the co-chairs here, Senator Paskovan, Senator Wagner. We also have room for other members of the Resources Committee. Excuse me. Today we'll hear the first of four-part presentation by Pedro Van Meurs. We will adjourn at 10:30 today because we have a conflicting meeting scheduled to get ready for the floor. We will reconvene at 1 o'clock this afternoon on the same subject matter, and then tomorrow we'll continue both morning and afternoon with the presentation, so we have it broken down into 4 segments. So with us today is Pedro Van Meurs, and I'd like him to go ahead and introduce himself for the committee, give us a little bit of his background, working relationship, not only professional background, but working relationship with the state over time. Even though a lot of us are familiar with him, there'll be folks at home that aren't, and then people that don't watch the oil and gas discussion as much as others may not be familiar with him and his past relationship. And we've been joined here with Senator French from the Resources Committee also, and Senator Stevens from the Resources Committee. Mr. Van Meurs.
It is a very great pleasure to be again in Juneau, and it is kind of you to allow me to present myself. Of course, I graduated in the Netherlands in economic geology with a PhD. Then I immigrated to Canada and worked in the Canadian oil industry as a consultant for many years. So then what I hope to do this morning is have the first session on a series of 4 that deals with policy options for Alaska oil and gas. The objective of Governor Purnell is to achieve a throughput of 1 million barrels per day through TAPS. I personally believe that goal is achievable entirely from the state of Alaska resources, and it is achievable, say, in the next 10 or 15 years or so. Of course, it is also my view that House Bill 110 does not even come close to taking a major step towards that goal, and consequently, I think a far more elaborate legislation would be required if Alaska indeed wants to see significant increases in production. What I hope to do in the 4 sessions is that it will be clear that major policy changes are required, as well as major fiscal changes that I hope to discuss during the seminar. If you want to reach 1 million barrels a day, you have to encourage very significant higher levels of investment. In order to reach that, in addition to whatever the companies are investing today, you would need to invest at least $7.5 billion a year to reach that goal. So that gives you an idea. Today, companies approximately reinvesting $10 to $15 a day per barrel. You would need to reinvest about $50 per barrel if you want to reach this goal. So a major shift would be required in investment patterns if you want to increase production in Alaska. Yes, sir.
Senator Stevens?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't know if you're coming back to the million barrels. Will you be discussing that later, or is this the only moment you will be mentioning that goal of 1 million barrels a day?
No, Senator Stevens, what I hope to do through the entire seminar is illustrate step by step how you can reach that goal.
And Mr. Chairman, I guess my question of you is it your belief that this is a good goal to try to achieve? Is 1 million barrels a day a good thing for Alaska?
No, of course, what is good for Alaska is for Alaskans to decide. When I was, say, at the seminar and in other seminars in Alaska, it is my impression that young Alaskan entrepreneurs and young Alaskans look for the future in the state, look for new opportunities, look for new business opportunities, new employment, and obviously with a declining oil production as it is, that may not materialize unless you bring new resources on stream. So if you believe that it is good to create employment and new business opportunities for Alaskans, then I think it would be a good goal.
Thank you.
Senator Wagner?
Morning, Pedro. You said it takes $7.5 billion a year over the current levels to reach that goal. What would it take to reach the goal if we had, some of us had a goal of, say, 600,000 barrels constant in production?
Now, in order to produce heavy oil, say, and other resources that you need to produce, more expensive resources than today, you need about $30 a barrel investment. So consequently, if you want to achieve for every $100,000 per day that you want for one day, you need to invest $3 million. So it is an enormous amount of investment required to reach